Hey guys, and welcome to our Unit 4 Political Geography review for the AP exam. So the big topics that we're going to talk about, and again, this isn't everything you need to know, just the basic overview: state, nation, and nation state, multinational states versus multi-state nations, the shapes of states, supranationalism, territoriality, heartland versus rimland theory, the types of boundaries, gerrymandering and redistricting, centripetal versus centrifugal forces, the law of the sea, federal versus unitary states, and devolution. So first up, let's talk about the difference between a state, a nation, and a nation state. A state is basically a country, all right? So state is a country. It's an organization, established government, has control over its internal and foreign affairs, defined territory with a permanent population. Now today there's around 200 states on the planet. Now, we can't give an exact number because, again, there are some that are questionable. Some countries consider them to be states, others not so much, like we've talked about with Taiwan. We also talked about with Western Sahara. These are kind of maybe states. A nation is a culturally defined group of people with a shared past and common future who relate to a territory and government. So a good example of a nation would be the Kurds. Now the Kurds want to have their own state, but they don't, which is why they're an example of what we call a stateless nation. A nation state is when that state, the country, and the nation match up, meaning it's a country with just one group of people in it. So it's a state whose territory corresponds to that particular ethnicity. There are no perfect nation states in the world. The closest that we have today is Japan. Almost, but not all, but almost everyone in Japan is Japanese. They speak Japanese, they follow Shintoism and Buddhism, etc. A multinational state is a country that contains more than one ethnicity with traditions of self-determination. A good example of this is Russia. Another good example of this would be the UK, where there's 4 different nations that make up the UK: Scotland, Ireland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, each of which does have traditions of self-determination. A multi-state nation is a group of people who share a common characteristic but live in multiple different states. A really good example of this is the Korean people who live in North and South Korea. Also the Basque people who live in Spain and France. Now you could also call the Basque people and the Kurdish people, you could call them stateless nations as well, since they're the minority groups in both of these countries. So obviously, if you look at a map of the world, you'll see that different countries or states are shaped differently. And there's pluses and minuses to these different shapes. Kind of the best shape, the most efficient shape, is a compact shape, which is pretty much circular. Now, there's no country that is a perfect circle, but semicircular is what compact means. So distance from the center to any boundary does not vary significantly. This is beneficial for smaller states because communication can be easily established. It's a good idea to put your capital in the middle so that you're close to kind of everybody, and that's going to be a compact. The second one is elongated. This is when it's long and skinny. This can be an issue because of poor communication. The capital may be isolated. People who live on one side of the country are really far away from the other side, and potential isolation means that people grow distant. The third shape is called prorupted. This is when it's basically compact, so basically circular, but it has like a long arm or projection coming off of it. Usually the reason for this is for access to a resource. A lot of times that resource is water for this prorupted shape. A perforated state is a state that completely surrounds another. So think of it like there's a hole punched out of it. That's what it looks like in terms of perforated. So it's South Africa that is perforated, not Lesotho. Lesotho would be compact shape, but because Lesotho basically punches a hole out of South Africa, it's South Africa that's perforated. The next is, and last is fragmented. Fragmented means that there's lots of discontinuous pieces of territory where they're not connected to the main body of the country. This can be problematic because this can have issues with communication, maintaining national unity, and so forth. The US would be a good example of this because of Alaska and Hawaii. And then obviously every single country that's made up of islands is an example of a fragmented state. You should also know the difference between enclaves and exclaves. An enclave is a piece of land totally surrounded by a foreign territory. So Lesotho would be example of an enclave. So would Vatican City and San Marino, which are both completely surrounded by the country of Italy. An exclave is land politically attached to a larger piece, but not physically attached. So Kaliningrad, which is a small piece of Russia that is found on the Baltic Sea, but it's not actually connected to the rest of Russia. It's separated from those Baltic states. Also, Alaska would be an example of an exclave. It is not attached to the United States, it's attached to Canada. So you should be able to look at the shape of a country and determine what it is. So here with this first one, we see the Philippines is fragmented as it is lots of different discontinuous pieces. We see here with Myanmar, this is going to be prorupted. So we see it's mainly compact and then this long extension that goes down the Malay Peninsula. The United States, which would be fragmented again. We see Zimbabwe, which would pretty much be compact. It's almost circular. Then coming down here, Poland, again, would be compact, almost circular. Vietnam here would be elongated. Thailand, again, would be prorupted. And then we see Kaliningrad, which is separated from the rest of Russia. That would be an example of an exclave. Next up is supranationalism. This is a group of 3 or more countries that comes together to work for some type of common goal. There's really 3 different categories that supranational organizations can be put into: economic, political, or military. The UN would be a really good example of a political organization. Their main goal is world peace. The European Union and NAFTA would mainly be economic. Their goal is trade, free trade between member states. NATO would be an example of a military organization. Theirs is a military pact. The pros of supranationalism bring countries together to help aid each other. The con is you can lose some cultural identity and sovereignty when you're part of these organizations. Territoriality is a country's sense of property and attachment towards its territory, as expressed by its determination to keep it inviolable and strongly defend it. So according to Robert Stack, the attempt by an individual or group to affect, influence, or control people, phenomena, or relationships by delimiting and asserting control over a geographic area. So you should know the geopolitical theories, Heartland and Rimland theory. So the Heartland theory, which was created by Mackinder, believed a land-based power would ultimately rule the world. He said that Eurasia was the most important area in the world, containing a pivot area extending from Eastern Europe to Eastern Siberia. And basically said who controls Eastern Europe rules the heartland, who rules the heartland rules the world island, who rules the world island rules the world. And again, this really was true for the Soviet Union. So this was how the Soviet Union was able to become such a large world power. The Rimland theory, which was created by Nicholas Spykman, believed the Eurasian rim, not its heart, so the area that surrounds that heartland, held the key to global power. And who controls the rimland rules Eurasia. Who rules Eurasia controls the destinies of the world. This saw a divided rimland as the key to the world balance of power. So this was really the US policy during the Cold War, making alliances along the rimland and making sure that the Soviet Union didn't spread into the rimland was known as containment, and that was the US policy. So here's again the map just kind of showing you what it means when we say heartland versus rimland. Next up, let's talk about boundaries. Physical boundaries are things that coincide with natural landscapes, things like rivers and mountains, which are going to be beneficial because you can actually see them. So, for example, the U.S. boundary with Mexico along the Texas-Mexico border is a physical boundary because it's the Rio Grande River, or the Great Lakes, marking the boundary between part of the US and Canada. We also have cultural boundaries, which follow the distribution of cultural characteristics. So the European boundaries are mainly cultural, mainly used in terms of language. Geometric boundaries are straight lines. So that's the rest of the boundary with Canada along that straight line. All right, so you should definitely understand gerrymandering. When we're talking about gerrymandering, we are only talking about the United States, and we are talking about the redistricting of congressional districts. So let's quickly review that. There are 435 members of the US House of Representatives, all right, and it's based on population, which means every time we do a census, which is every 10 years, we have to redraw all 435 of those districts to try to make them equal in population, which again sounds fair until you realize it's the politicians themselves that get to redraw these districts. So of course, if you're a politician, you're going to try to redraw your district to make sure that you win re-election. And this purposeful drawing of the legislative districts to benefit the party in power is known as gerrymandering. There are three different types of gerrymandering. The first is called a wasted vote. This spreads opposition supporters across many districts, but in the minority. The second is an excess vote, which concentrates opposition supporters into just a few districts. And then stacked vote, which links distant areas of like-minded voters into these oddly shaped boundaries. So if you see a map and you see a district that looks all crazy, it means it's a gerrymandered district. Next up is centripetal versus centrifugal forces. Centripetal forces are things that hold a state together. This can be things like ethnic unity, social and economic equality, a just and fair legal system, charismatic leadership, religious acceptance, nationalism, common heritage, common language, anything that unifies people together is a centripetal force. A centrifugal force are things that divide a state. So this can be ethnic conflict, social injustice, poverty, dictators, religious intolerance, nationalism, loss of rights, and any so forth, all right? So make sure we understand those differences. You should also make sure you know all about the UN Law of the Sea. So remember, the Law of the Sea was signed by most of the members of the UN, although not everyone, including the United States, who has not signed it. But the UN Law of the Sea basically tries to create boundaries for who controls what in the ocean. So according to this, 12 nautical miles from your coastline is known as your territorial waters. This territorial waters is basically like you're still in your country. So another country's ships cannot come in your territorial waters. If they do, it's basically an invasion. Now, 12 miles past that is known as the contiguous zone, which is kind of just a buffer zone between your EEZ and your territorial waters. 200 nautical miles from your coastline is known as your EEZ, or your exclusive economic zone. This means any natural resources found within these 200 miles, whether it's oil or fishing, is exclusively your country's. So Japan, their ship can be in our waters, but they cannot fish in our exclusive economic zone. Then past that is known as the high seas or international waters. And that's not under the jurisdiction of any one country, but instead is under the jurisdiction of the United Nations as a whole. So again, under the law of the sea, this defines the rights and responsibilities of nations with respect to their use of the world's oceans. So as we said, 12 nautical miles, territorial waters. 200 nautical miles is your exclusive economic zone. Then with international waters, it's known as the Common Heritage Clause, where they belong, the resources there belong to everyone, and you can't just like go out there and start killing all of the whales there, because it is under UN management, which means they can take you to international courts. Next up is federal versus unitary states. A federal state allocates strong power to units of local government within the country. So local governments possess considerable authority to adopt their own laws. This is more suitable for large states, especially multi-ethnic states, due to the national capital being usually far away from a large percentage of the population. A unitary state places most power in the hands of a central government. In principle, this works best in nation states because there's few internal cultural differences and a strong sense of national unity. And finally, devolution. So devolution is really kind of the giving more power to those units of local government. Sometimes this can actually lead to the breakup of a country. And when we see a country break into smaller countries due to conflict, it's known as balkanization. That's named after what happened to the country of Yugoslavia, which is on the Balkan Peninsula. Ethno-nationalism is a form of nationalism in which the nation is defined in terms of ethnicity. And irredentism is the movement intended to reclaim and reoccupy a lost homeland. A contemporary example of this is Russia, who annexed Crimea, which was part of Ukraine, because the majority of the people there were Russian. All right, so that concludes it for Unit 4, again, political geography. Just a quick reminder, this is not everything that you have to know. It's just the basic overview. You should still watch the AP Daily videos. You should review your AMSCO book and so forth.